Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Gidi Grinstein, who is a former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He was also involved in the negotiations with the PLO and at Yasser Arafat in the early 2000s. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I expect you're watching what's happening in Cairo like the rest of us. Does it look to you like we're on the cusp of the end of the war in Gaza?
Thank you very much for having me, Tom. And yes, I think that we are coming closer and closer to a deal that may end the war in Gaza. I think President Trump, through a series of statements over the last couple of weeks, actually converged the parties in a very, I would say, aggressive mediating approach. First of all, he said no annexation, no Israeli annexation in the West Bank, which took off a major concern for Arab parties who would have been part of the concluding deal. Another major statement is that he said that Israel will not be allowed to annex any part of the Gaza Strip, which speaks to a major demand, a core demand of Hamas. And then, of course, setting the expectations of the parties about a two-phase deal. Phase one is the hostages, the release of the Israeli hostages still held in Gaza after almost 2 years. October 7 is going to be 2 years. And then in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli jails, including a very significant numbers of what we call heavyweights, which means people that were convicted and are in jail for really horrific murders. Some of them are orchestrators of suicide bombings that claim the lives of dozens and dozens of civilians. So in this respect, President Trump has already kind of signaled the outline of what would be a ceasefire, exchange, and then a war-ending deal.
Okay, so President Trump has set out some red lines, if you like, and you know, clearly those talks have just got started. What sort of assurances, though, do you think Hamas is likely to seek from Israel? Because, I mean, looking at it from the outside, I mean, in Hamas's situation, were all the hostages to be freed, they would have no more bargaining chips, to put it crudely. So what assurances do you think they will seek from Israel?
I think that they're actually seeking the assurances from the Americans, not from Israel, because there's obviously absolute distrust between Israel and Hamas at this phase of the war, in this phase of this relationship. I'm just qualifying because in the past, Israel and Hamas in Gaza did have understandings around movement of people, movement of goods across the border, traffic, moving in of money, and even some restraint about use of military force in the engagement. All that belongs to the past. Now Israel and Hamas are in a condition of total lack of trust and absolute direct confrontation, what you may call a total war between the parties. So Hamas will expect guarantees from the Americans, especially since Hamas holds Israel to be the one who violated the ceasefire of January that was signed in January 2025, and Israel walked away from the ceasefire about 6 weeks later in March 2025. So Hamas wants assurances for the Americans. What are these assurances? They are the following. Number one, that eventually Israel will fully withdraw from Gaza. Number two, that Gaza will eventually be run by a self-governing Palestinian entity. They've already said yes to what is called a technocratic government, or a government of technocrats. What we mean by that is people whose credibility and qualifications for the job are the ability to build and run systems like healthcare, welfare, education, obviously the reconstruction of Gaza. So that will be a second major plea. A third thing is that once they leave Gaza, they have immunity. In this respect, I think that Trump understandings with Qatar, that where the United States has pledged to the security of Qatar, to the invulnerability of the Qatar sovereign space after Israel's attack on the Hamas leadership in Doha, that I hold this to be part of the deal, meaning it is essential for the Qataris to be able to say to Hamas leaders, if you come out of Gaza and you come to Qatar, you'll be in a safe haven, meaning if you, especially if you really live up to your pledge to stop the use of terrorism. That will be, I think, the third. The fourth element, which is very important for them, is that essentially, as Gaza is being reconstructed, I think that they will want to see that some of the civilian infrastructure of Hamas is integrated into the governing body of Gaza. But that is further down the road.
Okay, you make a lot of key points there, and one of them, which is not going to be lost on our audience, is the fact that one of the members of the delegation, I mean, the leader of the delegation of Hamas, is of course Khalil al-Hayya, who survived that assassination attempt in Doha. I mean, given the level of mistrust you were talking about, I mean, it's hard to imagine how they can achieve anything. But as you're saying, it's going to be very much down to the Americans to mediate between the two sides. Just with regards to that strike on Doha, do you think it was in some ways a catalyst to perhaps getting us to where we are today? Do you think that will go down in history as having been some sort of a turning point?
I think it's actually almost a pivotal moment in this whole conflict, because to the extent that I can judge from the American side effectively probably thought to themselves, this is going too far. When two of our allies, as much as they have tension between them, when two of our allies are beginning to exchange blows, military blows, on Doha, which is nearby a U.S. military base, this really disrupts the American order in the Middle East. The other thing that is of severe concern to the Americans is the fact that this strike came exactly at the time when Hamas was supposed to be convening in order to consider its response to the proposal of President Trump, which is probably not that different of what we're seeing right now. So basically, it was a major disruption to the process of negotiations and also to the stature of Qatar as one of the key mediators in this, in these efforts to end the war. So, and I think that the response of the Qataris was, I would say, quite remarkable. They got on a plane, they went to Washington, and within 36 hours, they were able to turn the table on Israel diplomatically, meaning Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, he said that the strike in Doha was not coordinated with the Americans, but he did claim to have the backing of the United States. Meanwhile, 48 hours later, 72 hours later, President Trump is already meeting with Arab leaders and agreeing on a set of principles that will eventually play a pivotal, a very significant role in shaping Trump's 20-point plan. Obviously, after that, there was an Israeli diplomatic intervention during the UN General Assembly that pushed the 20 points of Trump, again, a little bit in the direction of Israel, or significantly in the direction of Israel, if you listen to our prime minister. But anyhow, the Qatari leadership was able to use the attack on Doha, first of all, to push the negotiations toward a deal significantly forward, and second, to extract from the Americans unprecedented pledges to the integrity of their sovereignty. And that's also a big achievement for them. So yes, in those two respects, I think it was pivotal. I think the Americans signaled to the Israelis, created for Israel a red line, which means you cannot attack even your worst enemies in the territory of our allies. This just cannot work for us as a superpower that tries to be the hegemonic power in the Middle East.
Let's talk about what's going to be under discussion in Egypt. So obviously the hostages are the initial focus. Then if we look further on down the 20 points in the plan, of course, this request, this demand that Hamas disarm, but Hamas saying we won't disarm until we get a state of our own, a Palestinian state. How much of a spoiler do you think this demand that Hamas disarm and their subsequent rejection is going to be?
First of all, I want to elaborate a little bit of what does it mean for Hamas to be taken out of Gaza. There are four elements to this process. Number one is, of course, the dismantling of the armed capabilities of Hamas. We'll get back to that in a moment. The second is the political level, and that is that Hamas will not be able to participate in the Palestinian governing body, whether appointed or elected. I want to remind the audience that this is a provision in the Oslo Accords, meaning a party that does not accept the Oslo Accords cannot participate in the Palestinian Legislative Council. The problem is that this specific provision was ignored by the Americans, believe it or not, during the Bush administration. And they're the ones who pushed to allow for Hamas to participate in the elections. We could be seen, I'm talking about January 2006, could be seen as the beginning of the starting point of the tremendous crisis that we're in right now. So security and politics. The third element that needs to happen is that the social system of Hamas will be replaced by the education, welfare, and healthcare infrastructure of the self-governing Palestinian body. And the fourth element that has to be dismantled is the economic mechanism, the economic infrastructure of Hamas that relied primarily on their ability to control the borders and therefore the trafficking and the smuggling into Gaza, and also to control the labor pyramids into Israel that were a major source of income, and third, of course, to collect taxes within Gaza. So all these three elements are gone. So if I ask myself, are we on our way to dismantling Hamas as we understand it as an organization in Gaza? I would say yes. The economic component is no longer there. The social component should be replaced by the self-governing Palestinian body. Of course, in the agreement itself, in the 20 points, there's no participation of Hamas in the Palestinian political system. And now we're left with the security component. Now, there is a level. Hamas was a terror army that established itself in Gaza. This is the Israeli perspective. Hamas has been severely decimated and diminished. All of its strategic capabilities are probably gone. A lot of the tunnel infrastructure is destroyed. So it's what we call the frameworks, okay? The fighting frameworks, like the brigades and the battalions and even the platoons. All of this is now dismantled. So we're left with groups of fighters. And beyond a certain point, it gravitates from an army challenge to a law enforcement challenge. At that point, it should be the responsibility of the international force and the Palestinian police in Gaza to take care of the last remaining Hamas people who refuse to hand over the guns. I have to say that Israel wants the demilitarization of Gaza, but at the same time, Israel wants to enforce the demilitarization of Gaza, and that requires a police and military force. So there is a tension there. And I think that at some point, the Americans will turn to Israel and will say, which is it? Absolute demilitarization? Or do you want a security force, which is effectively a Palestinian security force in the longer term that governed Gaza, similar to the West Bank? So I think that, but the overarching principle should be the unitary of force under the Palestinian government, which is the same principle that is being applied in Lebanon, which underlies the demand to dismantle the military capabilities of Hezbollah. This is the overarching principle and should apply in Gaza, it should apply in the West Bank, it should apply in Lebanon, and in fact, also in Syria and everywhere.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, we heard what sounded like Prime Minister Netanyahu rejecting one of the points of the 20-point plan, the very next day after having discussed it with President Trump. Namely, he said a Palestinian state, that's not going to happen. He said that in Hebrew the day after he'd spoken with President Trump. But how much pressure is Netanyahu under domestically to reach some sort of a deal right now?
So Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure to reach a deal now, and these are things that are being seen as by many in Israel. Of course, Netanyahu has a very strong base that supports the claim that there will not be a Palestinian state. That base also rejects the role of the Palestinian Authority. At the same time, there are a lot of people in Israel who say, hey, this is just another political trick by Netanyahu to prevent a deal, a war-ending deal, which he fundamentally doesn't want. So that part of the opposition claims that Netanyahu is using all these long-term political demands in order to undermine the short-term deal. This is the claim against Netanyahu. I think that what we have seen from President Trump is that President Trump, in this current proposal, effectively collapsed the near-term deal of hostages and prisoners and redeployment and realignment of the IDF in Gaza with the longer-term arrangements for the reconstruction of Gaza, for establishing a self-governing Palestinian entity, and just enough statements about the long-term vision, the permanent status of Gaza. The key statement that President Trump put in is that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. And that is absolutely crucial and important. I think even sort of historically important, because many of the people behind the current Israeli government reject the notion that there are two indigenous people in the land of Israel, what we call the land of Israel, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and therefore that the Palestinian people does not deserve the right to self-determination. Meaning when Trump says that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, he's clashing heads-on with the perspective of the far right in Israel that denies that very statement, that the Palestinians are a people that have a right to self-determination. Now, what is this right of self-determination? It's not the ability as a people to define their political future. So saying the right of self-determination historically also means eventually that the Palestinians have a right to self-government, to statehood, to some political entity that allows them to express themselves and operate as a people in the international environment. Now, whether it's a full-fledged state with all powers and capabilities, like most people think about, or a state that has limited powers and limited abilities, that could be negotiated. But on the basic principle is in the Trump plan, and I think this is why we are closer to a deal than we have ever been in the last year.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Gidi Grinstein, the former Israeli peace negotiator. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you for having me.